Hey guys, today's global social issue I'll be talking about is terrorism. Let's get started. The most basic as best well-rounded definition of terrorism I found is the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians in the pursuit of political aims. Now, understanding that basic definition still doesn't make terrorism a simple black and white issue. To give you some perspective, in researching, I found there is no agreement on a common definition of terrorism. For instance, some nations, particularly in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, are unwilling to label groups as terrorists if they sympathized with their aims. This makes it complicated because there are emotions involved and change is wanted so desperately. So it's up to you to decide and find out what factors played into the act of terrorism. Is it warranted or not? Which goes back into a circle jerk of making terrorism a complicated issue of whose side we're speculating at, the victims or the person group who enacted the attack. Also, it's important to remember that terrorism is international. I don't think it's right for people to live in rose-colored glasses and assume that just because we don't experience it every day, that it does not happen anywhere else. That's a foolish thought, and I believe we need to be aware of that. So here I have listed a few different types of terrorism. They are state-sponsored terrorism, which consists of terrorist acts on a state or government by a state or government. There is dissent terrorism, which are terrorist groups which have rebelled against their government. There is religious terrorism, which are terrorist groups which are extremely religiously motivated. And then there is criminal terrorism, which are terrorist acts used to aid in crime and criminal profit. To the right of the screen, I've listed some ways that terrorist attacks can be performed, which are hostage taking, cyber terrorism, suicidal terrorism, and shootings. There is a long list of the effects of terrorism, but here I have listed just a few that I found to be the most common, such as people are often left on edge, depression from losing their community, people sustaining minor or major injuries, disease, PTSD, and chronic physical health consequences. The terrorism impact on OT can have different impacts depending on where and when the attack has taken place. Attacks such as ones in Syria or Iraq make it difficult for anyone to get treatment post-attack because clinics or hospitals have been destroyed or the clinicians have been killed or injured themselves. Terrorist attacks in the US, such as the 9/11 attack, can leave not only the everyday citizen with PTSD or injuries, but it's important to remember that medical health clinicians are just as susceptible. That can lead to more of a demand for OTs than there already is. We've come a long way since the arts and craft movement in the early 1900s. In this short clip, it will show you how a general didn't think anything good could come from his injured soldiers and how Ora Ruggles would prove and show that OT can do a whole lot of good. Let's watch.
After the Great War ended in 1918, the sweeping popularity of the Reconstruction aids secured a permanent spot for rehabilitation workers within American medicine. Reconstruction aide Ora Ruggles arrived at Fort McPherson in Atlanta, Georgia, where some 5,000 war amputees were hospitalized. A captain growled at Ora, "How in God's name can you help wrecks like these?" Ora replied, "By finding and teaching them occupations that will take their minds off their misfortunes, to make them aware of life again, and get them to respond to it. It is not enough to give a patient something to do with his hands. You must reach for the heart as well as the hands. It's the heart that really does the healing."
The OT theory I chose is the occupational adaptation theory. Most occupational therapy theories are driven by the assumption that as clients become more functional, they will be more adaptive. Occupational adaptation is the exact opposite. The client's dysfunction occurs because the person's ability to adapt has been challenged. The person's adaptive capacity can be overwhelmed by impairment, physical or emotional disabilities, and stressful life events. The greater the level of dysfunction, the greater is the demand for changes in the person's adaptive process. Fortunately, over the years, in our country and across the world, terrorist attacks are declining, but that does not mean they are not happening, especially with social media often magnifying certain attacks to make it feel like terrorist attacks are very much at large and rampant. As we see on this table, the Middle East is very much having attacks pretty often. Again, because the media is not showing attacks in the Middle East or anywhere else every day does not mean it's not happening. The people are still struggling. I believe we need to be aware and grateful that we live in the country we live in, and we should not take it for granted, and instead of being divisive and spreading hate, we should come together and help in ways that we can, because if we were in their shoes, we would want help too.